The monitor shrieked, that terrible flatline sound that meant everything was over. My father's hand slipped from mine, his grip loosening in that final moment, but not before he forced a sealed envelope into my palm with surprising strength. His voice broke as he whispered those last words, barely audible over the machine's alarm. "Run when you read it." Before I could ask what he meant, before I could even process that he was gone, my mother, Diane, snatched the envelope from my hand and shoved me backward. My older brother, Miles, moved faster than I'd ever seen him move, pocketing the envelope with practiced efficiency. "Dad wanted me to handle the paperwork," he said, his tone cold and businesslike, as if our father hadn't just died right in front of us. The nurse stepped forward and gently covered my father's face with a white sheet. I stood there in that sterile hospital room, completely stunned, while the people who should have been grieving alongside me were already dividing what was left of him like vultures picking at bones. My name is Evan Ross, and this is the story of how my family turned my father's death into a war I never meant to win. 3 months before that terrible hospital scene, Diane had called me at my apartment in Denver. Her voice carried more duty than actual care when she said, "Your father's not well. He wants to see you." I'd left home 5 years ago after one too many arguments with Miles about the family business, swearing I'd never step foot in that old farmhouse again. But this was different. Dad was sick, maybe dying, and despite everything, he was still my father. I packed a bag that same night and drove the 8 hours back to the small town I'd grown up in. The farmhouse looked exactly the same from the outside, white paint peeling in the same spots, the porch swing still hanging crooked. Inside felt different though, colder somehow, like the warmth had been sucked out of it. Dad was in his chair by the window, thinner than I remembered, his face gray. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or was it fear? I couldn't tell them. I should have paid more attention to that look. That first dinner back home was unbearable. Miles dominated the conversation, filling every silence with talk of profits, expansion plans, and what he called preserving the family legacy. Diane sat beside him, beaming with pride at her favorite son, like he was giving a presentation to investors. Every time I tried to speak, Miles would cut me off with some dismissive comment. "Maybe some people just aren't meant to run things," he said once, staring directly at me. "Not everyone has the vision required for business." Dad said nothing during these exchanges. He just sat at the head of the table, moving food around his plate, occasionally glancing at me with an ache in his eyes I didn't understand at the time. The few times our eyes met, he looked like he wanted to say something important, but couldn't find the words. Or maybe he was just too afraid. I realized now he was surrounded by people who'd already decided his fate, and mine, long before I came home. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I heard my door creak open. Dad shuffled in wearing his old bathrobe, looking around nervously like a criminal checking for witnesses. "Keep this safe," he whispered urgently, pressing something cold into my hand. It was a tarnished silver key, old and worn. "You'll need it soon. Don't tell anyone you have it." His hand shook as he gripped my shoulders. "They can't know, Evan. Especially not Miles." The fear in his voice made my stomach drop. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, but he just shook his head and put a finger to his lips. His eyes darted toward the hallway, listening for movement. "Promise me you'll keep it safe. Promise me." I promised, more confused than ever. He looked at me one more time, his expression a mixture of love and terror, then slipped back out into the darkness. I sat there holding that key for hours, wondering what my father was so frightened of. Now I know he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of what the living would do after he was gone. Morning sunlight exposed a dust-covered cabinet in Dad's study that I'd never really noticed before. The silver key fit the lock perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. But just as the door creaked open, Miles stormed into the room behind me. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he barked, his voice sharp with accusation. I quickly shut the cabinet door, my heart pounding. "Looking for old photos." I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad said there were some from when we were kids." Miles crossed his arms, his stare cold and calculating. He didn't believe me for a second. "Stay out of Dad's business, Evan. You left this family 5 years ago. You don't get to come back and start snooping around." He stood there blocking the doorway until I walked past him, making sure I understood this was his territory now. As I left, I felt his eyes burning into my back. He knew I'd found something, and from that moment on, I became a threat he needed to manage. The key stayed hidden in my sock that night, pressed against my ankle like a secret weapon. The next day, Dad's lawyer stopped by the house. Mr. Keaton was an old family friend who'd known Dad for 30 years. Miles hovered over him like a shadow the entire visit, inserting himself into every conversation, steering everything toward discussions of the estate and business matters. As Keaton prepared to leave, Miles walked him to the door, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. I followed them outside, and, just before getting in his car, Keaton managed to slip me his business card while Miles wasn't looking. "If anything happens to your father," he murmured under his breath, his eyes darting nervously toward the house, "call me before you trust anyone else. I mean anyone." The unease in his expression chilled me to my core. He knew something bad enough that he felt compelled to warn me, even at the risk of Miles noticing. I tucked the card into my wallet and watched him drive away, wondering what terrible knowledge he carried that made him look so frightened for me. That evening, Diane casually mentioned there would be a final review of Dad's estate with a lawyer the following week. "Miles has it all under control," she said while washing dishes, not even looking at me. "You don't need to be there. You just complicate things." The dismissal in her voice was clear. I wasn't family anymore, not in the way that mattered to them. I was an outsider who'd abandoned ship 5 years ago, and now they were making decisions about Dad's legacy without me. Shouldn't Dad be part of this discussion? I asked carefully. She turned to me then, her expression hard. "Your father's not well enough for complicated financial matters. Miles is handling everything. It's better this way." But Dad was still alive, still breathing, still capable of making his own choices. Yet they were already acting like he was gone, dividing up his life while he lay upstairs too weak to fight back. I realized then, with horrible clarity, that they weren't just preparing for his death. They were actively working around him, rewriting his wishes to fit their own plans. And I was the only thing standing in their way. I woke around midnight to raised voices downstairs. Dad's voice, stronger than I'd heard in weeks, roared through the house. "He's my son. You can't just cut him out." Then Miles's sharp reply, cold and cutting. "He abandoned this family. He abandoned you. He's a liability to everything we've built." A loud crash followed, the sound of something breaking. I ran downstairs to find Dad sitting at the kitchen table, hunched over and clutching his chest. His face was red, his breathing labored. Miles stood over him, his expression a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like satisfaction. When Miles saw me, his face twisted into a sneer. "This is your fault," he hissed. "Coming back here, upsetting him with your presence. He was fine before you showed up." The venom in his voice was shocking. Diane rushed past me to Dad's side, but even as she comforted him, she shot me a look that echoed Miles's sentiment. In their story, I was the villain, the prodigal son who'd caused nothing but trouble. Dad tried to speak, to defend me, but he was too weak. All he could do was reach for my hand and squeeze it weakly, an apology in his eyes. The next morning, while Miles and Diane were out, I finally got the chance to properly open that locked cabinet. My hand shook as I turned the key, half expecting them to burst through the door and catch me. Inside were stacks of papers, bank records, contracts with signatures that looked wrong. I pulled them out carefully, my heart pounding as I read through them. Transfers to Miles's personal account, tens of thousands of dollars labeled consulting fees for work that didn't exist. Forged signatures on contracts that redirected company profits. My stomach twisted as the full picture emerged. Miles hadn't just been managing Dad's business. He'd been systematically bleeding it dry for years, siphoning money into his own accounts while Dad got sicker and weaker. The dates went back 3 years. 3 years of theft, of lies, of taking advantage of a dying man's trust. I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. This was why Dad had given me the key. This was why he'd looked so afraid. He'd finally figured out what Miles was doing, but he was too weak to stop it alone. Miles cornered me in the driveway that afternoon as I was heading to my car. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Just for a drive," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, blocking my path, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. "You think Dad's going to believe you over me?" he said quietly, his smile razor-thin and dangerous. I've been here for 5 years while you were off playing at Independence in Denver. He already chose me, Evan. He chose me to run the business, to handle his affairs, to be the son he could count on. He leaned in closer, and I could smell coffee on his breath. Walk away, he whispered. Walk away now, or I'll bury you in so much paperwork and legal action you'll never see daylight. I have lawyers, Evan. Good ones. What do you have? The threat hung in the air between us. He was right about one thing. He had resources I didn't, but he didn't know about the photos on my phone, the evidence I'd already secured. I smiled back at him, matching his cold expression. Guess we'll see, I said and got in my car. That night, Dad collapsed in the kitchen. One moment he was standing at the counter trying to pour himself water. The next he was on the floor, gasping for breath. I called 911 while Diane screamed and tried to help him. The EMTs arrived within minutes, working quickly to stabilize him before loading him into the ambulance. As they worked on him, as Diane sobbed dramatically into her hands, I noticed Miles standing apart from the chaos. He was on his phone, his back turned to us, speaking in low tones. I moved closer, close enough to hear him say, "We'll need the transfer finalized before probate begins." Yes, that's right. Before. My blood ran cold. Our father was dying on the floor, and Miles was already planning how to steal what was left. At the hospital, they got Dad stabilized, but told us it wouldn't be long. His heart was failing. Days, maybe a week at most. Miles and Diane went into planning mode, discussing funeral arrangements and estate details, while Dad lay unconscious 20 feet away. I sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and promised him silently that I wouldn't let Miles win. The funeral was a theatrical production orchestrated entirely by Miles. He delivered a polished eulogy about family unity and honoring our father's vision that made my skin crawl. People who barely knew Dad showed up because Miles had made it a social event. Cameras flashed as local business leaders offered condolences. Diane clung to Miles throughout the service like he was the grieving son everyone should admire, while I stood in the back pew, invisible to most of the attendees. After the service, when people had filtered out to the reception, I asked Diane about the envelope Dad had given me in the hospital. Her expression turned icy. "What envelope?" she said coldly. "There was no envelope, Evan. Your father was barely conscious. You're imagining things." Miles appeared at her shoulder, his face sympathetic, but his eyes hard. "Grief does strange things to people," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Maybe you should go home and rest. We'll handle things here." They'd taken it. They'd stolen Dad's last message to me, and now they were gaslighting me about its existence. I walked out of that funeral home, knowing I was completely alone in this fight. A week after the funeral, I was getting groceries when a woman approached me in the parking lot. She was wearing scrubs and looked nervous, constantly glancing around like she expected to be caught. "You're Evan Ross?" she asked quietly. When I nodded, she pulled an envelope from her purse. "I'm Patricia, one of your father's nurses. He made me promise that if anything happened, I'd find you and give you this. He said it was important. He said your family might try to keep it from you." She pressed the envelope into my hands. It was the same one from the hospital, slightly crumpled now, but still sealed. "He was a good man," she said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Then she hurried away before I could thank her properly. I sat in my car with shaking hands and opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of the documents I'd found in the cabinet, along with a handwritten note in Dad's shaky writing. "They'll come for this. Don't let them. When you're ready, make it right. I trust you. I always have." That night, Miles called my cell phone. His voice was sugary and fake, completely different from his usual cold tone. "Evan, I think we got off on the wrong foot. We're both grieving, and that's made us say things we don't mean. Why don't we meet tomorrow and talk about Dad's accounts? Just us. No lawyers, just family." Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, but I agreed anyway. I needed to know what his next move was, and I'd already made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different secure locations. "Sure, Miles. Where do you want to meet?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Dad's old workshop," he suggested. "Tomorrow at noon. It feels right to talk about him there, surrounded by the things he built." The workshop, Dad's sanctuary, where he'd spent countless hours building furniture and teaching me how to use tools. Miles was choosing that location deliberately, trying to manipulate my emotions, to make me feel guilty or sentimental enough to go along with whatever scheme he'd planned. But two could play that game. I'll be there, I said, and hung up. Then I called Mr. Keaton and told him everything. The workshop smelled like sawdust and old wood, exactly like I remembered. Miles was already there when I arrived, leaning against Dad's old workbench with his arms crossed. "Glad you came," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We need to settle this thing between us. Dad wouldn't have wanted us fighting." I pulled out a copy of the documents and set them on the workbench. "You mean settle the fact that you've been stealing from him for 3 years?" His smile vanished instantly. "Those papers mean nothing," he said, but I could see sweat forming on his forehead. "They're out of context, misunderstood. I was managing the business. Sometimes transactions look irregular to people who don't understand finance." "Then why are you sweating?" I asked calmly. His face went red, and he lunged for the documents, trying to grab them off the workbench. I let him take them. They were copies of copies. Meaningless. "You're in over your head," he snarled, crumpling the papers. "You have no idea what you're doing. I'll destroy you." But the tremor in his voice told me he knew. He knew I had him, and he was terrified. The power dynamic had shifted, and he felt it. The next morning, I sat in Mr. Keaton's office while he carefully reviewed all the documents I'd brought. His hands trembled as he read through the evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. "Evan," he said finally, looking up at me with genuine concern, "this is criminal fraud. Your father was trying to undo it before he died. He came to me 2 weeks before he collapsed, wanting to know his options. He made notarized copies of everything, explaining that he'd been worried about this for months, but couldn't act without proof. Your father protected you by giving you that key," Keaton said. "He knew Miles would try to erase the evidence after he was gone. You need to stay quiet about this until I can get auditors involved. Don't confront Miles again. Don't tell Diane. If they know we're building a case, they'll find ways to hide assets or destroy more evidence." He filed the initial complaint with the state that afternoon. Within days, the wheels of justice would start turning, and Miles's carefully constructed fraud would begin to unravel. I just had to wait and trust the process, as hard as that was. The audit hit Miles like a freight train. Within a week of Keaton filing the complaint, investigators froze Miles's personal accounts pending a full review of the business finances. I wasn't there when he got the news, but I heard about it from neighbors. He'd apparently screamed at the bank manager for 20 minutes, threatening lawsuits and making a scene. Diane called me that same day, her voice shrill with rage. "You ruined your brother," she screamed into the phone. "How could you do this to your own family? Your father would be ashamed of you." The irony of her words was almost funny. Dad would be ashamed of me? I was the only one who'd try to protect his legacy, to stop the theft. But in Diane's mind, family loyalty meant protecting Miles no matter what he'd done. "Dad left me evidence, Diane," I said quietly. "He wanted me to stop this. He knew what Miles was doing." She went silent for a moment. "You're lying," she finally whispered, but the certainty was gone from her voice. "Dad would never." I hung up before she could twist a knife any deeper. There was nothing more to say to her. 2 days later, Diane showed up at my apartment. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes red and swollen. She was clutching a folder of old family photos like a lifeline. "Please," she said when I opened the door, "you're tearing this family apart. Miles made mistakes, but he's your brother. Can't we work this out privately?" I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She sat on my couch, spreading the photos across the coffee table. Pictures of us as kids, happy times that felt like they'd happened to different people. "We used to be a family," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Your father would want us to stay together." I pulled out Dad's handwritten note, the one that had been in the envelope, and handed it to her. She read it slowly, her face going pale as the implications sank in. "He knew," she whispered, looking up at me with genuine shock. "He knew what Miles was doing, and he gave this to you." I nodded. She sat there for a long moment, crying quietly, then stood up and left without another word. The photos stayed scattered across my coffee table, memories of a family that didn't exist anymore. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. "Local business under investigation for fraud," screamed the headline. Miles's face was plastered across the local news websites, looking haggard and cornered. Reporters camped outside his house, shouting questions every time he appeared. He held a press conference that afternoon, standing on his front porch with his lawyer beside him. "My jealous brother has fabricated these accusations," he shouted to the cameras, his face red with rage and desperation. "Evan Ross left this family years ago and has been bitter ever since. He's doctored financial records to make me look guilty because he wants control of our father's business." The lies flowed easily from his mouth. He'd always been good at performing, at making himself look like the victim. But this time, the evidence was too strong. Reporters started digging into the business records themselves. Other employees came forward with stories of suspicious transactions and forged signatures. Miles's carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time, and all I had to do was stay silent. The truth was louder than any defense I could have offered. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting the facts speak for themselves. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Miles sat at the defense table looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his posture. Diane sat in the front row behind him, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. Keaton presented the evidence methodically: bank records, forged signatures, emails between Miles and accountants discussing how to hide certain transactions from the old man. The most damning piece came near the end. Keaton produced a notarized statement Dad had signed 2 weeks before his death, documenting his suspicions about Miles and specifically naming him as the person forging signatures and stealing funds. The courtroom went completely silent as the judge read the statement aloud. Miles tried to stand, to object, but his knees buckled and his lawyer had to steady him. Diane let out a single, choked sob. Years of deception, of manipulation and greed crumbled in those few seconds. The judge looked at Miles with unconcealed disgust. "Mr. Ross, the evidence against you is overwhelming and disturbing. You betrayed your dying father's trust for personal gain. That's a special kind of cruelty." Sentencing would come later, but everyone in that room knew Miles was finished. Miles was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and perjury. The judge showed no mercy, stating that the betrayal of a dying parent for financial gain was one of the most morally reprehensible crimes she'd encountered. Diane lost the house, trying to cover legal fees and fines. The family business, what was left of it after Miles's theft, had to be dissolved to pay back creditors and settle lawsuits from business partners who'd also been defrauded. I didn't celebrate when the verdict came down. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I just felt exhausted and sad and relieved that it was finally over. Dad's name was cleared. The truth was public. Miles's punishment wouldn't bring Dad back or restore those lost years, but at least justice had been served. I stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, watching Miles being led away in handcuffs. He looked back at me once, and for a brief moment, I saw not my enemy, but the brother I'd once known, the one who used to help me build forts in the backyard. Then the moment passed, and he was just a criminal being taken to prison for crimes he'd committed against his own family. The silence that followed was strange and heavy. Diane stopped calling, stopped sending accusatory texts blaming me for destroying the family. Neighbors in Dad's old town whispered when I drove past, their conversations stopping abruptly when they noticed me. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with judgment for turning on family. I didn't try to explain myself to any of them. The court records were public. Anyone who wanted the truth could find it. I moved back to Denver and tried to rebuild the life I'd left behind. The apartment felt different now, smaller somehow, like I'd grown too big for it during those months of fighting. Friends asked how I was doing, and I gave them the standard responses: "I'm fine, getting through it, taking it one day at a time." But the truth was more complicated. I'd won the battle, but lost the war in some ways. My family was gone, scattered and broken. Dad was dead. Miles was in prison. Diane wanted nothing to do with me. Peace, I discovered, feels strange and uncomfortable after months of chaos and conflict. It's like your body forgets how to relax, constantly waiting for the next crisis that never comes. 6 months after the trial, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and right. I reopened Dad's shop under its original sign, Ross & Company. Hardware. The same squeaky door, the same smell of pine dust and machine oil, the same wooden counter where Dad used to stand helping customers. I rehired 3 workers who'd been laid off when the business dissolved, men who'd known Dad for decades and were grateful for the second chance. I set up a scholarship fund in Dad's name for local kids who wanted to study trades or business. It wasn't revenge I was after anymore. It was a restoration. I wanted to rebuild what Miles had tried to destroy, to honor the legacy Dad had actually wanted instead of the perverted version Miles had created. The shop struggled at first. People weren't sure if they wanted to support the family that had been all over the news. But slowly, old customers started coming back. They'd shake my hand and say things like, "Your dad will be proud," or "About time someone brought this place back to life." And slowly, painfully, I started to heal. I was cleaning out the shop's back office, sorting through boxes of old records and supplies, when I found an envelope wedged behind a picture frame on the wall. It was addressed to me in Dad's handwriting, dated just days before he'd collapsed that final time. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Evan, if you're reading this, it means the truth won. It means you were strong enough to stand up to them when I couldn't. I'm sorry I waited so long to act. Sorry I let fear keep me silent. You were always the best of us, the one with real integrity. Don't run anymore. Stand proud. The shop is yours now, along with everything I should have given you years ago. Build something better than I did. Build something honest. I love you, son. I always will." The tears came easily that time, not sad tears, but cleansing ones. Dad had known. He'd known I would fight for him, that I would see it through to the end. The envelope in the hospital hadn't been just evidence. It had been a test of character, a final gift from a father to his son. Trust and faith wrapped in yellowed paper. At dusk on the anniversary of Dad's death, I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, just birdsong and wind rustling through the trees. His headstone was simple, the way he would have wanted it. His name, dates, and the words "honest man, loving father." I knelt down and placed the empty envelope, the one that had started everything, on top of his headstone. "I didn't run, Dad," I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard me talking to a piece of granite. "You told me to run when I read it, but I couldn't. I had to stay and fight. I had to make it right, the way you wanted." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sawdust from the shop just down the road. Somewhere a door squeaked. My door, the shop door, still needing oil after all these months. I smiled at the thought. Some things didn't need to be fixed. Then I stood up, brushed the grass from my knees, and walked away from that grave, not feeling victorious, not feeling vengeful, just finally, completely free. The war was over. Truth had won, and I was still standing.